let's jump into to this week's episode, which I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge is a little bit different for me. The truth is, every week my kiddo asks me, so what are you doing on your show this week? Who are you talking to this week? Who are you interviewing this week? And I always try to find some sort of way to be honest and straightforward and sex positive, but also age appropriate. And I'll usually say something like, oh, we're going to talk about labels, or, oh, we're going to talk about how hard it can be to be trans sometimes, or, things like that. And I'll be honest, this week I drew a complete blank. It is difficult to explain to a 13-year-old what rubberism is. So latex, PVC, rubberist, Miss O'Kiss, what the hell are we actually talking about tonight?
So we're talking about, I guess, like latex fetish, and maybe some adjacent ones like, PVC, plastic, and things like that. And like a rubberist are people who have a fondness and enthusiasm for mostly garments, but not necessarily items made out of rubber like latex. So that can be, clothing. Some people, have it like maybe latex sheets or bondage gear. But it can be like pretty PG-13. Like,
Yeah, no
for some
doubt.
people, it's just like a sensory thing. So there's a lot of reasons to get into it. Some of them are, PG. Some of them are not.
Well, so you have a background in fashion and design, right? So
Right.
so tell us about your professional work in this space.
Wow, yeah. I actually got into clothing design by accident originally. Because I am, not that you can tell from this, really short. I am 5 foot nothing, and I did not reach that statuesque height until I was about 19. So nothing fit.
Mm.
And I started making my own clothes because of that. And I ended up making latex clothing a lot later than when I first tried to get started in it, because in the 90s, it was really, really hard to do. um, but yeah, so I've been designing clothing since I moved to America in 2002. And
Mm-hmm.
it kind of grew from there. And I've been doing custom costuming and fetish wear for a good few years now, probably last 8 years, give or take.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I know that this is a big question, but as you can or as you like, what can you tell us about the history of latex clothing?
Um, it is a lot longer than people think. Like, a lot
Sure.
of people think about it as like a really modern thing. But it actually got started in the 1800s with the first rubber Macintosh, which was where a very clever guy, I guess, discovered that if you cover fabric in rubber, it becomes more waterproof. And that was the selling point originally. But a lot of people started wearing it and going, I like this protection from the rain, but I also like this regardless of the rain. And from there on, like, the early rubber garments, from what I gather or have read, were kind of stinky and did not hold their texture well. But people were like, well, it's good, and we like this. So it kind of grew from there. Like, the history of latex, it seems to start off very practical, and then people buy these practical items and we're like, ooh, I like this. So we have like the Macintosh Society was like dedicated to those rubber coats. That was, I think it might be or it's one of the oldest fetish societies that were organized in England, at least, or Britain.
Mhm.
People were writing really enthusiastic letters to bawdy magazines like London Life in like the 1920s about it. And it kind of stayed around there, like rainwear, for a while until like I want to say like the 1950s. The first cat suit was created, a rubber one. And it was originally protective wear for bikers. I'm assuming that there was a fabric component there too, because I have put my hands through my latex more times than I would care to admit on screen. And again,
No.
people were like, maybe this protects me when I'm on my bike, but well, I kind of like it, and maybe I want to wear this at home. And it was being sold to people at home. And I want to say like maybe Barbarella and definitely the spy show, The Avengers, which I actually watched with my dad as a kid. Not the first time around, but it had like Emma Peel, and she had it was like I think it was like a pleather cat suit, but it was like
Mhm.
based on this like original one that was by a guy called John Sutcliffe, not Peter Sutcliffe. He was a murderer. Yes, John Sutcliffe. So that was on the screen, and everyone was like, "I like this lady in this tight, shiny outing," and it
This kind of
became,
works for me.
and that's kind of where it like took the jump from from like practical and into like that kind of like imagination point. Because
Mhm.
with like the latex, some people get really into it for a sensory reason. Sometimes it's there's a lot of cultural like baggage that's gotten tied up in there too. Like people will associate it with like BDSM, especially like dominatrixes and things like that. And I think a lot of the reason like it started getting into that kind of part of our brains was, you know, through things like Emma Peel kicking ass in that like shiny cat suit, or later, I think, who doesn't remember the Batman
That's where
Catwoman?
my
Uh-huh.
mind
Yeah,
goes. Yeah,
Right.
Lee Merriweather back in like in 65 or so. I mean,
right.
these things are getting fetishized pretty quickly, which was kind of to me the most interesting part of all of this is just how quickly we went from, hey, this seems like a good idea, might be useful to keep people from getting wet, and then somebody else went, but you know what else it does? Like
Make
The
it even
almost
opposite of
tighter.
keeping you from
immediately.
getting wet.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's like was like the everything. Like if you put something out there, people like candles. Anything's a dildo if you're brave enough, right? Like you can make anything for whatever you want, but people will find other uses for it. And I think because like rubber clothing has such a really unique sensory like profile and experience, that that's still what I think draws a lot of people. I don't know. I want to say like most people, but I don't know. Like I think it's kind of like permeated into like fashion layers too. Like it was big with like Vivienne Westwood and her sex shop with Malcolm McLaren back in the 70s, where like the punks were using kind of like bondage gear to like subvert, you know, what was culturally acceptable outside the house. So it was like a shock tactic there. But I think like definitely the sensory aspect makes sense. Like it's I think what pulled me in.
No
But
doubt. I
yeah,
mean,
like
it's confining. It's shiny. The colors that you're able to capture are
wow.
vivid in a
Oh
way that
yeah.
you don't get with cotton or linen or things like that.
Absolutely.
Uh, I guess I'm curious to better understand latex as a fabric. That feels like a very strange question for my professional life to have
Right.
eventually guided me to. But you're telling me that you have like cut through it more often than you'd care to admit, and from what I understand, it's actually very difficult to work with. What are the limitations? Like, is there something appealing about that challenge? Like, what would
Yes.
folks who don't know how to sew shit need to understand about what we're talking about here?
Um, I mean, it's like, yeah, we use it like a fabric, I guess, but obviously it's not a fabric. And it's not even sewn. I think like historically, maybe it has been, you know, when it was over fabrics, as like a treatment, but
Hmm.
it's glued down. So it's a lot of finagling. It's like a little bit chemistry, a little bit engineering, a little bit fashion, and then eventually out
And a
comes
lot
like
of
a
it
garment.
sex.
So
Mm.
yeah.
I was about to say, and a lot of exploration. Yeah.
Yeah,
Of
like
what works and what
I
doesn't.
spend so much time like trying out different like adhesive thinners and preparations to get everything like perfect, because I'm an obnoxious perfectionist, and I'm like, I need this to be smooth and no lumps and no bumps, and it has to stick forever, and I'm really paranoid about things coming apart, so it has to stick forever. And it was a lot of experimentation, and it's a lot easier now. Like just all the colors you mentioned, you see now, it's kind of recent. Historically, people were getting it from like medical suppliers. I guess they'd make like sheeting for hospital beds, things like that. And that's kind of what people were using, which is like one of the suppliers I use has a color, medical red, because I'm guessing it was one that was used in the medical field. So you had like black, I think like a reddish color, it's kind of like an orangey reddish color, maybe white, but there weren't really a lot of color options. That came, yeah, I don't know when that started, but I fairly like recent, like maybe the 90s, like late 90s was when that was starting to happen. And I love the colors. It's great. Like everyone wants classic black, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, but
Sure.
there's something real fun about like those like perfect saturated colors that are just it's just like all the same, and it almost looks like a drawing. It's great.
Hmm.
That's what I
Yeah,
was gonna say.
and
It's almost like digital art. Yeah.
Right.
no, exactly. There's something inherent about the shine to it, and I know that we're going to be poking around the edges of the kind of unique sensory experience here, but it's worth noting that there's almost something like a ASMR like visual quality to the
Yes.
nature of that shininess. It's hard to describe. I'm not really sure what the terminology would even be here.
Yeah, that's how I describe it to a lot of people actually, because not only does it have that visual appeal too, but it also has that like sound. Like I think latex has a great sound. I love the sound of it. It's awesome. I was looking at, like one treatment that means it so you don't have to use lube, and I was like, ooh, and like, but it doesn't make the sound and it doesn't smell the same, and I'm like, I'm out.
Fake bullshit.
That sounds cool and all, but whoa, what cost? But it has like a great like crinkly sound, so for some people like that. I don't know why it really pisses me off on ASMR videos. It really irritates me. I'm like, but on latex, I'm like, yes, I'll have more of that, please. So it has a really cool, and it's like, I mean, they say it's like a second skin, but it really is. Like one of the things that surprised me with it is how cold it can be. Like it can
Hmm.
get really sweaty, but it is the temperature of outside. So you can be wearing like a lot of it, but if you go outside and it's 18 degrees, congratulations, you're 18 degrees and very well clothed. It's like, so it's like, yeah, you feel like your environment a lot more,
Hmm.
which is kind of interesting. And because like most fabrics, when they stretch, you've got like a four-way stretch maybe. So it'll go, warp, weft, that's it. But because like latex is rubber, it stretches in every single conceivable direction. So you can get a much closer fit. And from a fashion aspect, it's actually really interesting because it can be very forgiving or it can be very constraining, and depending on like how the thickness of it, you can play with all kinds of different things. It's really fascinating, I find.
Yeah. Well, then, as a designer, what drew you to wanting to work with latex?
Wow. I think originally just because I thought it was like the first time I actually saw latex in person was, I want to say like 98. It was in like this weird little boutique that I used to walk past on the way to college, and they had a bunch in there, and it was aimed at like club kids because it was like a big rave scene, the city I was at, and this stuff was so cool. Like when you move it, it has this great move on the hanger, and it made like this kind of like almost clangy sound. It was fascinating. And that was when I wanted to start making it, because I'm like, well, what can you do with this stuff? Like, because it's like nothing else I'd ever worked with. I could not find sheeting back then because I was looking at fashion sauces, and I should have been looking at medical suppliers apparently. So that came much later. But I think like for me, a lot of it was, I love the sensory aspect of it, but a lot of the way it's presented is in a very specific way. Like it's very narrow. Got like the cat suits and everything else. But it's like this amazing material that you can do so much with. So it's like, what else can you do with it? And for me, like I liked trying to make almost like everyday clothing out of it, because that way you can wear it wherever you want to go. Like you can go out to a restaurant in it, you can go out to HEB in it. Like if you go in a full like cat suit with a hood, that's gonna be a little off-putting to people maybe. But that's them. But like if you've got like, so I was making like street clothes out of it for a while, because then I could wear it wherever, and it was really interesting to try and come up with a different look that hadn't been done before and that I kind of felt might be more accessible.
Mhm.
Because one thing I've learned about like fashion in general, but definitely latex, is a lot of people are real interested in it, but then really put off, I think, because they don't see themselves in it. Like if you look at a lot of the editorials and everything else, like it's a very specific body type wearing a very specific kind of garment, and if you don't fit that exact body type, it's like I can't wear latex because I don't have flat abs and fake boobs, for example. And the fact is, like, if you can wear clothes that you think make you look good, you can wear latex because you can make the clothes that you think make you look good out of rubber. Like, I think that was like one thing that I found really interesting to try and do to make it kind of open it up and maybe make it so more people felt like they could see themselves in it, and enjoy it without having to prescribe to like this specific gaze. There are a lot of the imagery and everything else. It's a hard slog. Like I am still trying to win people over on that. Everyone's like, I can't wear it because I am a size ... And I'm like, you can, because the thing you're wearing right now, you could wear out of latex. Like you just
I like
gotta...
that notion of everyday clothes because there is something kind of inherently transgressive, I think, about just wearing latex out in public. In the same ways that not everybody with a leather jacket is automatically like a Hell's Angel, but maybe they are, right? Maybe there is that sort of like everybody in blue jeans isn't a cowboy, but you're sort of aligning yourself in this way with something that is kind of naughty or potentially nasty, depending on the framework that you're looking for.
And I think that's one of the things that draws a lot of people in. Like, I mean, it was definitely why it ended up being used by like the 1970s punks, for example, was that like, it's not nice to have outside. And people were trying to like break down those boundaries. And I mean, when you see things like Jean Paul Gaultier in the 90s, when, it was like underwear is outerwear. And like, I think we've been breaking down those sort of boundaries of quote unquote decency standards for a while. And I've definitely seen like a lot more latex in like high fashion, like the past few years, maybe like I want to say like the last 10 years, but I've lost all sense of time. Like,
Yeah, what
I
is a
feel
year
like it
at
was
this
the
stage of
90s
life?
2 years ago, and now
Yeah.
like there's people who were born in 2000 and they can drink. So it's very confusing. But like, yeah, like you see it a lot more on like the runways. People use it a lot in like music videos, and I think like some of it is like trying to catch on the cachet of like this taboo quality around it. One of the models I follow, who is an awesome artist actually, and she's just all around fascinating person. And I will have to get the name because I'm never sure I'm pronouncing it right. But Tess Karagi, I think, and she was talking about how like a lot of fetishists, social media contributions are constantly getting like censored. But then when someone exploits that same like taboo for profit or whatever, like same as like sex workers and everything else, like it's okay. And it's really interesting how like, because before you weren't seeing it that much in mainstream culture, but now you do. It's like real obvious when one side is getting shut down and the other one is not. And it's like
Mhm.
banking on this taboo cachet without actually like putting anything in. And then when people are being
Sacrificing
authentic,
for it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's weird.
Fucking
But I also
posers.
love that it's gotten kind of like, I mean, the more accepted it is, the more opportunities people have to wear it. Like, if you're only wearing it at home or at certain like play spaces, that's really limiting. But if you can go out and wear it and no one's like, oh, like super pearl clutchy, maybe some places, I've been some places which have been real pearl clutchy, and because I live in Austin, I have a real weird idea of where that like bar is.
That's super fair. That's a hard thing about this town to explain to the world is that like Birkenstocks and shorts and a t-shirt are acceptable at board meetings and fancy restaurants, but like so is a suit at a barbecue. Like,
Right.
yeah, you can kind of get away with anything here.
Yeah, I was out once with a friend of mine, and a woman literally steered her children away from us in Fort Worth. And I was like, I forgot. Like, she was
But
wearing
to
like
me,
these. I think it's like some sort of like weird Satan boot with like an inverted cross and a bunch of other shit on it, and I was like, right, that's not okay everywhere, I guess. And in
Not
Fort
everywhere.
Worth, they were like, no. But yeah, I think like it's definitely opened up more opportunities for people, and I think some people get in for the fashion, and some people maybe come in for that and then stick around longer because they're like, much like the people in the raincoats are like, I like this, but I also like this, and it's been kind of interesting to see more people wanting to get involved. Actually, it's kind of cool.
Well, and you talk about the taboo aspect of it, and I think a lot of times, it is that aspect of people just not knowing, right? When something is sort of underground or kept hush hush or is not socially acceptable. So having people, especially like you who are designing clothes that are just everyday wear out in public clothes, and even the fashion models sort of taking it up, to me that like that's really awesome and something to be celebrated because it breaks down that taboo. And so that pearl clutching mom, maybe 10 years from now, will see somebody maybe dressed a little bit more freely and loosely, and she won't have that like visceral negative reaction about it. You know what I'm saying? Like it'll be a
So
little bit more acceptable. And also people might be more willing to learn more about it. Right. So
yeah,
I kind of like the message that you have here about the taking it to the streets. And having said that, I did have a question for you because you had mentioned earlier about it feeling like a second skin, right?
right.
And you're talking in terms of just clothing, not in terms of like specifically a kink or a specific thing that you want to accomplish with it, but just as clothing. And
Right.
someone like me who has I'm really oversensitive to certain kinds of touch, and it sounds from the outside like it'd be really constricting and really terrifying. But the way you're describing it as a second skin sounds really comforting and sounds really like appealing. So I was wondering if you could talk more about just the feeling and the sensory aspect of it, since that's a word you've used like quite a bit so far.
Yeah, like so latex comes in a lot of different gauges, which is like thicknesses. So some of it's like real thin, almost like a balloon, for example. And some of it's like really thick, which is getting closer to like a car tire. So depending on that is going to depend on like how constricting it is. But also like, because like I said, it stretches in all directions, it'll contour a lot like your skin does. Like, I mean, condoms are made out of latex if you think about it, and the point of that is all the protection, but it's you can kind of closely, I guess, forget that it's there. So it's a little bit like that, like it'll acclimate to the body temperature and the outside temperature, so you don't get that hot stuffiness like you would expect from it. And if it's kind of light, you can kind of forget it's there, to be honest.
There's
um
a like an exhibitionist, voyeuristic aspect to all of this, to be sure. Like
Right.
the way that you are kind of hugging the curves, maybe even kind of smoothing over certain blemishes or maybe aspects of your body that you are simplifying, if I can maybe use that idea. And I just find that so fascinating, the notion of being like thoroughly fully dressed, there in a situation where maybe you don't even show any skin, and yet there's a sensation and almost even an appearance of being naked. And I think that's so sexy and so fascinating.
It's really interesting. And I think a lot of people play with that in a lot of different ways. Because, like, for example, you get very used to this sort of oddly airbrushed media, for example.
Mhm.
So you got this like poreless second skin. Like it has that kind of like just super smooth and like you said, like blemish free and everything else free, which can be really appealing to a lot of people. And for a lot of people too, like does that anonymity, like I don't want to like liken it necessarily to furries, but it's actually a little bit similar for some people. Like
I think that makes sense.
you can play out this whole persona, which might be, I don't know, like a expression of yourself, but you can do it whilst being completely, your identity completely obscured, for example. So you can have the sensation of like being naked, but also not being seen. And there's a lot of aspects people like to play with that. Like, you can use it to change like shift in to identities, bodies that are
Mm.
different. These people use like inflatables. You can inflate it. So you
Oh,
can
yeah.
enhance body parts that way. I've known a lot of people who like to play either with like a gender that they do not feel connected to or one that they do, because it's a way to kind of get the body to feel more like it should feel, than maybe it does. So you can kind of like change things to be more, I guess, idealized, because we've all got that vision
Yeah.
of ourselves in our heads that we want. And then there's a reality, like, we're all weird, dimply, fuzzy creatures.
You know what's
But
interesting is as you were talking, I was thinking the opposite. Like you could actually highlight parts of your body that a lot of people tend to not idealize. Like
yeah,
I'm a little bit chubbier and I'm not always okay with that because the kind of ideal of beauty is that like what you were saying, the six pack and the
right.
fake boobs, right? And that's just not me. So, one of the things I think could be so empowering about what you're saying is the idea that you could do exactly the opposite. I could highlight my belly and say, "Yeah, this is my belly. This is who I am," and make it a really sexy thing.
And actually, like, I think latex works really well with, like, I'm a squishy person. um, Very much. And like because of the way like pressure and stuff like works on it, like I haven't got my PVC on at the moment because latex and cat hair can't really see it. But you press on it and it like dimples and you get the light. So you can kind of play with that like texture of like, I guess, the flesh underneath. And it can be really interesting to do that in a way where it's like celebrated and visually or tactilely interesting.
Mm,
And it doesn't come with that same kind of like vulnerability and exposure, I guess, for want of a better
Mm-hmm.
word, because
mhm.
it's there, but it's also hidden. And it's like this really interesting dichotomy between being exposed and being completely concealed, for example. And you can do both at the exact same time. So, like, I think for people who've got like an active fantasy world, latex can be a really interesting tool to explore that for quite a lot of people.
Yeah, and the anonymity that you can be borrowing here, I think, definitely lends itself to not only exploration in that sense, but it can also be a little bit dehumanizing. There's
Yep.
definitely a dom sub aspect that feels almost like inherent to the fabric. I mean, I know that we are projecting that as we sexualize and fetishize these things, but there almost feels like an innate power dynamic when somebody is wearing latex that could almost go either way. It's strange to try and put your finger on it, but I
Right.
don't know. What can you say about everything you see there?
I mean, a lot of it might come back to like again, Catwoman and Emerald Peel. Like it's got this superhuman quality that we're used to seeing. So if you go like with that angle, you can get this kind of sense of like not just strength, but like superhuman strength and power with it. And it can be very commanding with the silhouettes that way. But also it can be used for like bondage, and also, that naked feeling can be very vulnerable and scary for people, so you can use it to kind of exploit that. If you got someone who's you can use kind of like an element of fear almost, like this is going to
Mm.
sound like the weirdest analogy, but do bear with me. There was an artist in England, and I forget the name again because I am horrible with names and only good with faces. But they created, like, the two-way mirror. It was a public restroom, and it was all mirrored glass on the outside, but you could see everything when you were on the inside. And it was like this terrifying thing, fear. Like you can pee in the middle of I want to say like Leicester Square or something. It was some
People
really
aren't
busy spot
actually
like that.
seeing you,
Yeah,
but
no
you're
one can
seeing them
see you.
as if they are.
And that is horrifying for a lot of people. And you can use latex in a similar way. Like it can feel very exposed when you're not. So you can maybe push boundaries that way that you wouldn't be able to push otherwise. Like, if you're out, even at like kink events, like full nudity can be,
Mm.
not okay. But you can still get that feeling of exposure without actually crossing those lines. Like I have one act in actually I have a few acts in it now. I've used this costume piece for so many, but I have a entirely transparent latex outfit that I wear for like burlesque sometimes, and it's totally legal and fine, and it covers all the bits it needs to. But like it's almost like it's not there, and it's like an interesting thing to play with. And I think people exploit that kind of element of vulnerability and power with it really well. Um, like there's like the bondagey element to it, which you can get with like the heavier gauges, and because it's so contouring, I guess, for want of a better word, like you can get it really tight. Like you can get leather so tight, but after a while it's like pinchy. But with latex, you can really immobilize a person with it in so many fabulously creative ways.
And consensual. Yeah.
And consensual ways too. Yeah, back to that Dexter thing. Don't get any ideas to future lumberjacks of America.
Right. Well, that's really fascinating. It's interesting to see the various different ways that it can be used. And so I wanna throw it out there to the audience. If there's anybody who has any questions about latex and its use, or if you have any stories to share, like that would be fascinating to hear other people's experiences with latex. Because I'm really turned on to the idea of just exploring just the conversation of it at the very least.